Hello everyone, I'm Dan Williams. I'm the Executive Director from the American Red Cross serving Northern Minnesota. And I'm here today with Lori Hendrickson, who's an Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension. We're talking a little bit about financial recovery after disasters. One of the main things that the Red Cross does, and what my role is with the Red Cross, is helping people who have faced disasters recover. And so one way that we do that really effectively is to work with partners from around the state, around our local region, around the country. And so this is a great opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about what tools that are available from the University of Minnesota Extension, and to have you learn a little bit more of that, to have you be more prepared if you face disaster and to be more resilient in advance of disasters. So Lori, would tell us a little bit about this video?
Sure. Well, going back a few years, and I should say first, we really do appreciate partnerships in our work as well, and certainly with the American Red Cross and other disaster organizations throughout the state. They were key in developing these materials. In 2009, there were a number of disasters both in Minnesota and in North Dakota, and educators from both states got together and talked about, as they were helping families with their recovery efforts, particularly in family resource management, and talking about the financial decisions that they might make. There was a realization that there was a need for information and tools for people as they approached their recovery after disaster. And as they were looking into this more and more, we developed something called the Recovery After Disaster, the Family Financial Toolkit. Now, the Family Financial Toolkit is great in its form like this, lots of worksheets for people to prepare and to fill out the information that they might need in disaster recovery. But what we're finding is that in disaster situations, very often people don't have access to a computer, they don't have access to a printer to be able to download and print off the materials, to be able to access all those great tools and the information provided. And so that became really clear in 2012 when we were all involved then in the disaster recovery centers in the Duluth area. And we provided some of the materials from the toolkit to families that came through the disaster recovery centers. However, we were finding that people couldn't just take the information and go home and print it off, because there may not have been a home to come back to. There may not have been a computer or a printer. And so we had to think of another way that we could share that information immediately with families that needed it. And so from the toolkit, then we decided to go back and write another USDA grant, and we developed a series of 6 videos. They're YouTube-like videos. In fact, they're posted on YouTube, and we're able to then share that material with people immediately as a disaster is occurring, and they can access the information that they need, use it on a tablet or on a smartphone, and use just the pieces that they need in order to influence their recovery after disaster.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The Red Cross does things very similar in some ways. You know, we have certain tools like moving forward after a disaster, or picking up the pieces after a home fire. Portable, movable. You have to get them to people when they need them, and we also have those sort of materials online. So I totally understand where you're coming from. Printing off a lot of materials while you're in the middle of a disaster is really, really problematic. Right. So could you tell me a little bit about the financial recovery series itself?
Sure. So the video series has 6 full-length videos. They run anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes in length. Probably the longest one is My Finances, which deals particularly with what are those particular financial decisions that you're going to need to make. Taking a look at spending and saving plans, what was happening before, and how does that change after disaster? Is income impacted? As you go forward and you are trying to make decisions about rebuilding or remodeling or those things that happen after a disaster, do you have the ability to take on additional loans or debt in order to finance those items? And so they range with the topic. We've tried to develop individual topics so that people can access just what they need. So if you're interested in just insurance information, you could find that information. If you're interested in learning about what FEMA and SBA offer in terms of disaster assistance, then you can find that information as well. So there's a range of topics available in the disaster video series.
Yeah, that's great, because a lot of times there might be certain resources available after a disaster and certain resources that aren't available. And I certainly experienced that in my role with Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota after the 2012 floods as well, in that there's many people who made financial decisions based on a short-term thinking and ended up really feeling the financial pain, often a year or 2 years after the flooding occurred.
Right. We tend to make decisions in a crisis situation that are not necessarily the best decisions for our situation, and they're not sustainable decisions. We think it's going to help us to get from here to there and to start getting our life back to normal, and that's not necessarily what happens. And the reality is, your personal reality is never going to be the same, and we have to take a look at that and realize that things will change, but we can't just jump in and make a decision and then worry about it later. We really do need to look at the long-term impact of those decisions.
Yeah, but I think that's one of the great things about this video series as well is even having people having the chance to check out this video series before a disaster occurs, I think could really build resiliency among people, because they'll have thought about these things a little bit when the pressure's not on, when they're not having lots of emotions and stressors and that sort of thing in their life. And so it's a good thing that these videos are being made available to people and being shared on public access television.
And when we made that decision to share them, one of the factors was, as we went out and did trainings around the videos and our supporting material, that's what we were hearing from people like you, they're disaster recovery professionals, and some of the volunteer staff as well, talking about, well, we need people to know this information up front. And maybe sometimes after a disaster is a little too late. You could go ahead and save yourself some of the heartache if you know ahead of time what you need to know. And so that's why we decided to provide this as preparation information as well.
Yeah, and so there's also lots of great resources on www.redcross.org about disaster preparedness as well as response. And so I'd encourage everybody to check out that, as well as these financial recovery toolkit videos.
Right, and we'll be putting the information up at the end of the program as well. Okay, well, should we take a look at the first video then?
That sounds great.
Okay, so the first one that we're talking about is bounce back and adapt. And you talked about resiliency and how important that was. And, it's important for people to stay connected. They might not feel like they need support of others in disaster recovery. And what we found is it truly is important not only to maintain those social connections, but also to know what assistance might be available as you go throughout the process, and by keeping connections with your support friends and family around the area, but also with those organizations that can help out. It's really important in that idea of bouncing back and getting started, taking control of the actions that you can personally control and feel like you have some control in a situation that's otherwise chaotic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So this is bounce back and adapt.
These tools will help you think through the situation that you're in, to establish priorities and decide what needs to be done, and help you to act with purpose in moving forward after the disaster.
It's not one big step, we'd like it to be, but it's really a bunch of small steps going on.
We saw a lot of people make some very, very difficult decisions in their own lives, and for a good number of people that meant leaving.
Resilience is important in your ability to deal with and adapt to change after a disaster.
Resilience was an ability kind of built into us. Everyone has that ability. That's one of the first things to lay hold of.
You have to advocate for yourself, and you have to know what it is that you're wanting, and know that you're in it for the long haul, and to be really persistent and determined.
It's important that they are connected to other people who they trust and that care about their circumstances, and as they're going through the recovery that they can reach out if they have a particular need.
Watch out and keep your own best interests at heart, even though it might be that time where you're emotionally just torn in every direction.
Yeah, that was really good information. I think that component about resiliency and about the bouncing back and having things that you can control is really important. Why don't we take a look at the next segment?
Sure, and the next video would be finding help. And that one simply is looking at where do you find sources of help and assistance after a disaster. What we saw in our work in the disaster recovery centers in the Duluth area was that people would come in and say, well, I'm fine, but you should see what happened to my neighbor. And they really weren't looking for assistance for themselves. They thought they could manage on their own, when really there may have been some things out there that could alleviate some of their problems as well. And so it's just a matter of helping people to know what is available in helping resources.
Yeah, and I think a key part of that is that it does take courage to ask for help, and it's one of the best decisions a person can make. After 17 years of working in the nonprofit world in northern Minnesota here, I can really tell you, if you have a feeling that you might need help with something, get it, because both you, your family, and the community will all be better off if you access the resources that are available.
Yes. So this is finding help.
It is okay to ask for help. It is okay to look for the helps and to recognize that people in voluntary organizations are reaching out to say, let's do this together.
In a perfect world, we would be prepared for a disaster, but we know that this is not always the case.
We're 2 years removed, and there are a lot of people that have still had a difficult time making decisions on what to do. As you see a lot of empty houses still around here, there's a couple of houses that have never been touched since the flood.
When a disaster happens, case managers are sometimes available to assist survivors. Recovery from disaster is difficult and complicated, and a case manager can guide you on this journey.
The role of case management as a system is to be the backbone of recovery. Helping them to understand what resources they have is a huge part of that, and how to make do with those resources.
There's a lot of services that are available and out there after a natural disaster, and you'd be surprised at how just talking it out with somebody else can take a whole big weight off your shoulders.
After a disaster, some communities may organize a long-term recovery committee. This committee is made up of community, government, and faith-based agency representatives and community leaders who address the unmet needs of individuals and families, as well as the community as a whole following a disaster.
Long-term recovery will not only help them, put some 2x4s back up and put sheetrock and put new carpet in, but help them think through how are they going to deal with this financially? What do they need to do psychologically?
Finding help is a really important segment. We're lucky in northern Minnesota here. Head of the Lakes United Way handles information referral through their 211 service. So it's a really great resource we have locally, and particularly in someone facing a disaster, finding ways to access those resources is really vital. So what about this next segment?
Okay, the next one, well, you and I have both worked in the financial world for a while, and so this one is probably closer to my work in family resource management, but it's my finances. And it really is that piece that we were talking about earlier in helping people to understand making an informed decision that they can sustain over time. And, we would really like people to think about developing that spending and saving plan now, if you haven't already got one in place, so that if something occurs in the future, you can go back to that spending and saving plan and to actually see, what has happened in the past and how were you managing, and what kind of resources do you have in the future to take on something new, or how does that plan change if a disaster impacts your income or spending that you need to take on. And so there are quite a few. This is the longest segment that we have is the My Finances, because there are so many decisions that we make after a disaster that are financial in nature. We may not always think about it in that way, but they are fairly related to our finances.
Yep. And it really reminds me about the importance. We always hear people talking about the importance of emergency savings, emergency savings, and it really is a great example of a time when you really can't predict, right, when a disaster is going to happen, when something's going to happen to you. And so it really reminds us of the importance of savings and living within one's means. And the more stable someone is financially, if you're seeing this video before a disaster strikes, it's really a good time to take the opportunity to sit down as a family and decide, what are things that we should, what are decisions that we should make now that would make us more resilient financially if a disaster occurred, or if a regular thing happens, like a layoff or a medical expense or that sort of thing. And so it's really a good chance to take a look at this and understand from a financial perspective as well.
Another component of that video is taking a look at the grab and go file, or what are those papers that you should have ready to go if you need to leave, and keeping that information in a file that is waterproof. If you can develop those kinds of files ahead of time and know that they are there, and if you need to get out, whether it's a fire or a flood, whatever it happens to be, you have that information available, you can take it. It alleviates that going back and trying to recreate that information or find lost items along the way.
Yeah, and it's one advantage of technology as well, right? So, we've always talked about having things that you can take with you, or waterproof things or that sort of thing, but it's also a great chance to take the opportunity to scan those documents that you really need, email them to yourself to an email account so that you can access them later remotely if you need to.
Right, or put them on a jump drive and take them with you.
Yep, absolutely.
So you can have those, yeah. So this is my finances.
We look differently at our finances than we ever used to.
This was whole new territory for us and for everyone in the Valley to basically figure out what can we afford to do.
Financially recovering after a disaster is like putting together a picture puzzle. First, you must identify the puzzle pieces of your current or post-disaster financial picture. The more pieces you identify, the easier it is to find the next pieces. So the more you know about your current financial situation, the easier it will be to figure out what you need as you work toward financial recovery.
At some point, you do have to say, okay, here's what our budget is, and here's what we can afford. And if taking out all those loans takes you outside of what you can afford, you're going to have to choose some other options.
Knowing your net worth is great in terms of just kind of a snapshot of your financial health, and it's another great thing to just kind of track over time.
There may be low interest loans available to disaster survivors. That's a great thing, but if I can't afford the payment, I may end up losing my house anyway.
Knowing the big picture of your financial situation will help you make the best decisions for your situation and possibly speed your recovery from disaster.
If we can make it look good on paper, we have a chance to make it look good in reality. If we can't make it look good on paper, there's no way that we're going to magically make it look good in reality.
There are people out there who are ready and willing to help you make those decisions and to make the right decisions and to make sure you're going to be taken care of as you go forward in this.
So this next video, it talks about FEMA and Small Business Administration resources, and we all know that disaster come in all shapes and sizes, right? So a home fire is one type of disaster that causes the same sorts of consequences as a hurricane hitting an area. But this next section really talks about larger disasters where there may be federal resources available through FEMA or Small Business Administration. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things, as we worked with an advisory committee of both disaster professionals and disaster survivors, we had originally looked at putting the insurance coverage and SBA and FEMA resources all together in one video. And our survivors particularly came back and said, no, that these resources might not be available for all disasters, and people may not be interested in knowing all that information along with their insurance information. So we decided to separate those out into separate videos. The FEMA and SBA resources, again, are dependent on the type of disaster and the scale of disaster, and so that's going to be different in each situation. One thing that I have noticed over the course of years is that when people don't report their individual damage that has occurred on their property, that can influence those FEMA and SBA resources. So we really always encourage people to go ahead and at least get your information out there, share it with the officials that are asking for your information, because that can really impact both the public and the individual resources that we're able to obtain.
Yeah, disaster assessments are it's a really difficult field, and it's really difficult to, especially quickly, get a good grasp of what the extent of a disaster is. So I definitely understand what you're saying that.
And I think it's pretty ambiguous, so people don't understand what that's all about. So this is meant to give them a little bit of an overview of what is available for a larger scale disaster, or how to get in that system as well.
Well, let's take a look at that then.
Great.
So a lot of folks may have homeowners insurance, but they don't have flood insurance. And if it's a flash flood event and they're not in a flood zone, chances are they don't have flood insurance policy. And that's where FEMA really comes into play.
If enough homes are damaged severely enough and survivors do not have insurance to cover the costs of repair, the President can issue a declaration of individual assistance. This will help eligible survivors with housing costs and other needs.
It's to help people with the repairs to their home and temporary housing. Individuals and households are programs that come together to help people get back up on their feet. That's what we kind of do in a disaster recovery center. We match up the need with the resource.
They're prepared. They handle a lot of the disasters nationwide, obviously, so they're experienced. So they kind of understand what they're going to walk into and the shell shock and the, reactions. Everybody's reactions from what they told me is different, from anger to extreme sadness to just that plain old shock.
If an individual assistance declaration is made, a Small Business Administration or SBA declaration is automatic. Survivors will learn if their income qualifies them for an SBA loan.
So our disaster assistance comes in the form of a low-interest loan, and it's one of the many tools that are out there during a disaster offered from federal and state and local resources.
It was great to learn a little bit about that FEMA and SBA information. This next segment's about insurance coverage. So could you tell me a little bit about that?
Right. One thing that we hear often from people is, well, I don't have flood insurance, so I know I'm not covered. But the important thing, again, is to talk with your insurance agent and to make sure that you are not covered if you believe you're not, or you may be surprised that there are elements of your policy that you were unaware of. And one thing that we always encourage people to do is annually do an insurance checkup and check back on that policy so that you are aware of what's involved in that. So that's an action step that people can take in preparation, and then you have a little bit more knowledge about what is available in your insurance. And again, just sharing that information with your insurance agent after a disaster has occurred is important, because even though you may not have coverage for your particular incident, you may find that the insurance agent is aware of other resources that you may be able to access.
Yep, I think not only we think of large disasters like flooding, where flood insurance is often this big gap, particularly in areas where you're not necessarily in an obvious flood area or that sort of thing, but also remind people the importance of homeowners insurance and renters insurance. So home fires are by far the largest likely disaster to impact a person in that devastating way. And so it's important for people to think about, do I have renters insurance? Do I have homeowners insurance? And is the coverage that I have appropriate?
And we often find that with renters, they don't have renters insurance, and it's such a minimal cost when it's combined with, say, your auto insurance. And if you think about the components that you have in your home, the items that, electronic items alone probably would take care of that value, the cost of a renter's insurance policy, and just saving those items perhaps would make a difference.
Well, and the big thing that renters insurance or homeowners insurance covers as well is a place to stay. And
absolutely.
So that's one of the major costs, and it really can be a devastating impact on a family to be in that chaos. That's one of the things that the Red Cross does in disaster response is sheltering. So providing a shelter for a larger disaster, or money for a hotel for smaller disasters. But renters insurance or homeowners insurance can make a big difference in that, particularly the amount of time that's able to be provided under that.
Right. So again, knowing those coverages within your policy and checking regularly to know what is in that policy is important.
Well, why don't we take a look at this segment on insurance then?
All right.
Following a disaster, insurance can be a key piece of the puzzle for a successful recovery.
Well, the first thing was they offered reassurance, that this is covered, your policy covers this type of a disaster, so rest assured, we'll take care of you.
Basic homeowners insurance covers the structure of the home, personal property, loss of use, and other structures on the property.
He was a lifesaver. He immediately got us money so we could start making decisions right away. Within days, we had cash flow.
Renters may also purchase insurance to cover personal property and loss of use caused by a disaster. Additional insurance policies would need to be purchased to cover damage caused by floods, earthquakes, and hurricanes. They are not covered under basic homeowners insurance.
I didn't know anybody else that had flood insurance, and I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to say, well, I'm okay. But I had a lot of friends that didn't. It was very difficult watching them struggle with their finances and trying to figure out how they were going to pay for this and what they were going to do.
It is important to recognize that your life will never be exactly the same as it was. Consider what you want your new reality to look like. Knowing your insurance agent and your insurance coverage may help you frame your new reality.
So that was great to learn a little bit more about insurance in that last segment. This next segment's about exploring your options. And so could you tell me a little bit more about what that means?
Sure. As we worked with our advisory committee to determine the topics that we would address in these videos, one of the things that they really were concerned about is that, you know, not everything turns out perfect after disaster. Not everything comes back to normal, and we really need to address some of those issues that people might have to make some very hard decisions in their lives, such as filing bankruptcy, or perhaps their property being bought out or acquired. And so how do you approach those topics, and when do you take a look at those? And certainly we recommend that those are the last resorts in your disaster recovery efforts. Certainly you want to come back to your home and you want everything to be like it was before, but that's not always the case. And so we have to take a hard look at what can actually happen sometimes.
And I think a key part of that also is making sure that you're getting good advice about it. So
Right.
I think in disasters, there can be people that take advantage of situations, have a financial interest in giving advice that they do. So I think it's really important that we also share resources that are available to people like reputable financial counseling agencies, nonprofits, local community action agencies, and that sort of thing as well. So we'll talk a little bit about more of some of those resources after this segment, I think.
Yeah, and certainly we show in the video 2 different legal aid attorneys, and so they're giving some advice as to what they would look at in terms of when is it good to make this type of decision, and again, underscoring that this is probably the last choice we'd make in our recovery efforts.
Okay, well let's go ahead and take a look at this video then.
Okay.
Following a disaster, there may be a variety of financial resources available. Many resources and options may be available whether or not the disaster has been federally declared for individual and personal assistance. Some assistance options may be available immediately, and others may become available throughout the recovery process.
The hope that we would have is that people would actually look for more information and keep asking questions until they feel that they can make an informed decision.
If you don't have insurance or don't have enough insurance, then you can tap into some federal and state resources such as FEMA, and your state may offer some disaster resources. Once those 2 have covered your losses, then you move into what we call an unmet needs area, and there may be other resources that come in during a disaster that will cover some of those unmet needs.
If you have reviewed your finances and determined that you cannot meet your financial obligations and take on additional debt, you may find that voluntary foreclosure and bankruptcy are options to consider. Always seek the advice of a financial professional before making these decisions.
Communication is the key there, because otherwise, if we're not communicating to our creditors, they can only assume what our intentions are. If there's no contact, no communication, you know, the interpretation might be that you have no intent to pay on your loans. They might not know that these things have happened. And without communicating with them and without reaching out to them, you might not know what options that they have available.
Be sure to take your time and make your decision with full knowledge of your finances and how each will affect your future.
There are people out there who are ready and willing to help you make those decisions and to make the right decisions and to make sure you're going to be taken care of as you go forward in this.
And that's a really tough segment, right? Because there's lots of bad things that can happen after a disaster. And we're lucky in northern Minnesota to have some really good resources locally, like AEOA, Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota Financial Counseling, which are HUD-approved agencies that can provide that really good, solid, reputable advice about those sorts of financial issues and what your rights are and what your housing options might be as well.
Right, and to note also that with the University of Minnesota Extension, we do have a group of extension educators that are also accredited financial counselors that can meet with individuals following a disaster situation. We're very happy to do that.
Yeah. So what would you like to, what's your overall thoughts after seeing this segment again and talking about it? What are some things you'd want to remind people about?
Sure, and just as to why we're doing this as a kind of a preparation, as we haven't experienced any natural disasters at this point, and we're very thankful that that's the case. But to underscore the idea that now is the time to take a look at these items. These are actionable items that we can do. And things like preparing a spending and saving plan, having that available so that if a disaster does occur, we can then compare that to how things change and to see what kind of resources that we have available, to have that emergency savings account. We think when we hear that we should have 3 to 6 months in savings, oh my goodness, that's such a huge amount to even think about. But if we can put even a little bit away each month towards that emergency account, it's something we don't have to worry about later. Checking that insurance coverage and knowing what we have available to us. Also, keeping a good record of those financial papers that we would need to take with us in case of disaster and what to do about that. And then, the other items like understanding the resources that we have and understanding what resources might come into the area. Those are other items that if we are watching the videos and understanding a little bit about it, then that gives us one step ahead on what could occur in a disaster situation.
Yeah, that's great. I think these videos would be a great tool for people, and really encourage people to think about going to redcross.org and checking out both their preparedness information that they have for preparing for disasters in terms of things like an emergency kit,
right,
and things like supplies that they would have, and other advice like these videos talk about, but also response and recovery information as well. So there's some great resources there along with these videos.
Yes, and we have the University of Minnesota Extension website. That would be www.extension.umn.edu and /family to get to the disaster materials.
Okay.
And again, as you said, there are materials for each stage of disaster preparedness and recovery and understanding each aspect of those.
Well, that's great.
So the next thing to be aware of is that the full-length videos will be following this. So we want people to stay tuned and to follow up and watch the full-length videos as well.
That sounds great. Let's take a look.
All right.